hunger, world hunger in particular. I don't want to dwell on how awful it is. I think we know that pretty well. I do want to talk a little bit about why we do so little to end it. It's easy to blame the system. I do that more often. But I know that I could personally do a lot more than I do. And my hunger is in my conscience. I'm hungry for solutions to end the physical hunger of other people. So how can I decrease the gap between what I want, what I say, and what I actually do? How can I do more? How can I be more effective? That's what I'm interested in myself today. And I'm directing it at myself because I think it's easier to process that when we look inwards. So I invite you to explore your own feelings, but realize that I'm talking about where I'm coming from. Briefly, world hunger is awful. Here are just a few reliable statistics. You can find these anywhere. They're pretty consistent. Every day, about 13% of people in the world are hungry, consuming a diet of less than 2,000 calories. Almost 1 billion people every day go to bed each night undernourished. Vitamin deficiencies leave people vulnerable to diseases. That's something that's often undercounted, especially in countries without good sanitation. Hunger and malnutrition exists on every continent, often right next to pockets of great wealth. Over 60% of people who are hungry live in Asia or the South Pacific. Those who suffer the most from hunger are generally women and children. The World Bank estimates that 60% of the hungry are women or girls. More than 250,000 women are so undernourished that every year, due to iron deficiency, they die due to hemorrhaging during childbirth. As one might expect, malnutrition begins in utero. 17 million children are born severely underweight every year. In 2008, the British medical journal Lancet said that if children are malnourished during their first 100 days of development from conception through 2 years old, they are likely to suffer permanent brain damage and body damage. In developing countries, nearly 1 out of every 15 children dies from hunger. According to Ending Hunger in Our Lifetime, which is a publication of the International Food Policy Research Institute, more than 1 out of 4 preschool children in developing countries are underweight by UN standards. And things are getting worse, they're not getting better, statistically. In 2000, there were 8 million more hungry children than there were in 1990. Anemia is rampant due to lack of iron. A disease of the thyroid gland called goiter affects over 750 million people, and that's caused by a lack of iodine. Vitamin A deficiency stunts the growth and ruins the eyesight of 250 million preschool children every year. The death toll is staggering. I've been using the statistic for years that 10,000 children a day die of hunger or hunger-related diseases. And I just read that has been doubled recently, that more than 20,000 children a day die from hunger. So, how do you process that? How do you process that sort of barrel full of depressing facts? Well, for a long time, historically, we sort of just say, well, that's the way life is. That's the way it's been. Hunger will always be with us. It's been with us forever. It's a part of life, from Bible stories of famine to early American history. Hunger has always stalked us. During the first winters at Jamestown Colony, John Smith recorded the horrors of what was known as the starving time. If you remember your history classes in high school, in 1609, over 90% of the colonists at Jamestown starved to death. Smith wrote that the 60 people who survived were, quote, the most miserable and poor creatures. He reported that some stooped to cannibalism. There was even a report that a man killed and consumed his own wife. It was indeed, as John Smith said, too vile to say and too scarce to be believed what we endured. And Smith wasn't even there for most of the winter. By the time I was growing up, there was a different narrative. Not that hunger was always there, but that hunger was going to be defeated through science and ingenuity. That's what I grew up hearing. And the United States history was where we were blessed with abundant land and a diseases that wiped out Native Americans, giving us all their tilled land, and the colonists replaced starvation with abundance, and so we celebrate Thanksgiving coming up. After the revolution from England, blessed by technological ingenuity, we became the breadbasket of the world for a lot of people. During the time period known as Pax Americana, right after World War II, battling hunger became a patriotic part of showing the rest of the world that we were better than communism. And that was how that narrative began to be. And that's what I remember hearing. That food was the best way to show that people had more to lose than their chains. So we had this, and the U.S. had the UN to support these efforts. The UN took on this battle. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization began distributing information and equipment necessary for developing nations to defeat hunger. The UN World Food Program delivered food to poor nations, especially during natural disasters. The UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development and then other agencies like USAID began pushing this. Add to that the Green Revolution of the 70s and 80s, which were really, 60s, 70s, and 80s, that really is what made the biggest dent in hunger, because productivity soared due to the Green Revolution. Amartya Sen, the winner of the 1998 Nobel Prize in Economics, explained this in an article he wrote in 1981 called Poverty and Famine, an essay on entitlement and deprivation. And he demonstrated that world hunger was not because there was not enough food, but because of a production and distribution problem of poverty and profits and politics. So this growing awareness that it was our technical abilities that made us possible to feed everybody, that was reflected in the UN Millennium Goals. The number one UN Millennium Goal is, quote, to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. That's pretty bold. At the 2004 American Ethical Union Assembly, we voted to support the Millennium Goals. At the 2004 Assembly, we said that we'd also support lifting 500 million people out of a state of hunger by 2015. Well, that's next year. This bold goal is reflected by an altruistic aspiration, but also it's in our self-interest to try to push for the eradication of hunger. This was something that President Obama said in a 2012 speech at the Symposium of Global Agriculture and Food Security. He cited national security issues. He said, "For we've seen how spikes in food prices can plunge millions of people into poverty, which in turn can spark riots and cost lives, and can lead to instability. And this danger will only grow if the surging global population isn't matched by surging food production and distribution. So reducing malnutrition and hunger around the world advances international peace and security, and that includes the national security of the United States." It's a good strategy to appeal to us, I think, to say it's in our self-interest. This is something that Pope Benedict said in 2009. He said, "The elimination of world hunger also in the global era becomes a requirement for safeguarding the peace and stability of the planet." And that makes sense. In 2012, the first legally binding international agreement on food was signed. It was the Food Assistance Convention. It was the same year that the Copenhagen Consensus declared that reduction of hunger and malnutrition should be the top development priority, more important than anything else. But now in 2014, it's clear we're going to fall short of our goals by far. So why? Why is this? Again, it could be easy to blame the system. Capitalism is a good punching bag, but as I explained last April in a talk that Gary asked me to give on capitalism, capitalism is responsible for a lot of the surge in the amount of food that we have, and so I think it has to be given some of the credit for how much food we've produced. But while the world produces enough food for everybody, the very poor don't have enough land to grow their food on or enough money to buy the food that's available. So is this inevitable? Is it an inevitable part? Laissez-faire, free market extremists think that it is. I mean, in Common Era 200, the Roman Tertullian wrote that, in fact, quote, "Pestilence and hunger and war and flood must be considered a remedy for nations, like a pruning back of the human race becoming excessive in numbers. Well, that was echoed, this pruning, a brutal pruning, was advocated by Thomas Malthus and his followers, who said that in the early work, certainly, of Malthus, he moderated near the end of this, he said that starvation was a solution to overpopulation. Seems like an odd solution. Mid-19th century British conservatives in Parliament seized on this attitude when they condemned food aid as encouraging laziness. Apparently they believed that people work best when desperate and on the verge of starvation. Well, I heard echoes of that during the Reagan era when welfare queens were condemned. Remember that? That it was their own fault, they were leeching off the system. Tea Party enthusiasts today also want to kill food stamp programs because they believe it discourages people from fending for themselves. Some today even compare giving food to people without money to be the same as feeding wild animals, that it encourages dangerous situations. But that's a minority, I think. That extreme callous attitude is not the real problem within our system. I think the bigger problem is that we treat food as a commodity rather than a human right. That, to me, is the biggest problem. And this is a diverse thing that most of us buy into. There was a recent article in Spiegel, the German magazine online, which is entitled, "How Global Investors Make Money Out of Hunger." And it outlines how food prices have been manipulated by speculators to increase profits, but it drives countries into situations of famine. So the manipulation of food prices, sending millions of people into functional poverty, is a huge reason why we have hunger today. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, in 2008, food prices rose 40% in 1 year in the developing world. Grain and cooking oil and fat went up 70%. In some countries, cornmeal, the most basic staple, doubled in only 6 months. And poor families spend 3/4 of their income on food. And for them, these swings in prices kill. Writer Walter Mosley put it this way. He said, "The basic cause of global hunger is not underproduction. It is a production and distribution system that treats food as a commodity rather than a right. In developing countries, huge agribusinesses, fat with government subsidies, sell their unsustainable and sometimes genetically modified products at reduced rates, thus making it impossible for local farmers to compete. Farmers who can't compete, can't feed their families and work their own fields, no longer have means to survive. Hunger becomes both a cause and an effect of poverty." University of Minnesota professor Phil Regan puts it even more bluntly. He says, "For the higher-ups in the ag biotech industry, the images of starving people were largely useful as poster children." Sort of like, we're going to solve this problem. He continues, "In more intimate small meetings, it was a different story. Their eyes were on the profits that could be made by selling food as population continued to increase relative to available land." He argues that our current system ignores the old adage of teaching somebody to fish, because, in fact, corporations would rather get some rich person to buy the fish to give to the poor people, because that makes higher profits. That's his analysis, that poor farmers are denied equipment and supplies that will bring them what they need, and that biotech and agribusiness has almost a near monopoly on world food, and as a result, shareholders get more than the starving. I'm going to examine that more. But this winter, Amartya Sen, that I said, he won the International Humanist and Ethical Union Award in 2002, and I heard him speak by Skype in Washington at the conference. And he explained that today the cause is not a lack of food, but the political and economic hurdles that keep poor farmers in poverty. He said, "Guess what? Famines happen in the presence of food because people have no ability to buy it." That's very different than the story that I was told growing up, that we have to produce more food. This is a human choice we're talking about. So there's good reason to blame that part of the system. But it's easier to blame the system. So I want to come back and talk about why I'm not doing more on this. I want to do more. I want to help eradicate hunger. I see it as a moral imperative. I agree with the philosopher Simone Weil, who said that feeding the hungry is the most obvious of all human obligations. And that social progress is measured by how many people you take out of the situation of hunger. Pope Francis, only a few days after he became the head of the Catholic Church, said, "Whenever food is thrown out, it's as if it was stolen from the table of the poor, from the hungry." I agree. Most religions regard food as a moral imperative and a great manifestation of faith. Does humanism believe that? I mean, Gandhi said, "To a hungry man, a piece of bread is the face of God." I agree with President Obama. He said, "I consider this a moral imperative. As the wealthiest nation on earth, I believe the United States has a moral obligation to lead the fight against hunger and malnutrition." But we fall short. I fall short. So, as an ethical humanist leader, how do I process this gap between ideals and actions? I mean, I think when I was young, I went around on Halloween one year collecting for UNICEF. Remember Trick or Treat for UNICEF? Little orange boxes. I was told that we weren't supposed to get candy either. All my friends got both. And at the end of the day, I resented them. But I thought I was just supposed to collect this money. But I grew up feeling guilty. I grew up embarrassed and ashamed. As an adult, I've moderated this self-censure to a degree, this gap between what I am and what I want to be. It's humbling to admit your hypocrisy, but I think it's the first step in growing. The founder of ethical humanism, Felix Adler, he talked a lot about the gap between ideals and actualities. And he said this is a major source of what he called spiritual pain. You can call it whatever you want, but it hurts, and it's persistent. He said that this is the sort of pain that, quote, never ceases to exist. I could choose to be ethically blind about this gap. I could avoid the discomfort by discarding my ideals, and without them I could enjoy a life free of stress. That would be nice, in some ways. But I have a conscience. I have a conscience that hungers for moral meaning and for ethical inspiration. So I want to use my life of privilege and comfort to make a difference, even if the difference is modest. I don't want to let my ethical ideals go, but I want to respond better than I am now. So, one of the biggest roadblocks, I think, between effective engagement is that the problem seems to dwarf anything I could do. It seems so overwhelming. When I'm brave enough to have my eyes open, hunger and other sources of suffering is like a bottomless pit that I want to turn away from. That was what Adler felt when he talked about the suffering that was caused by World War I. And he wrote one of my favorite passages. He said, "The pain is due to the fate of those innumerable fellow beings who perish by the wayside, while mankind slowly and awkwardly tries to achieve progress. I mean by those many thousands dying unhelped in hospitals. I mean the victims of the foul conditions that exist in slums. I mean the millions of young lives that were cut short during the late war. We stand, as it were, on the shore and see multitudes of our fellow human beings struggling in the water, stretching forth their arms, sinking, drowning, and we are powerless to assist them." We're not powerless to assist any of them, but there are millions that we will never reach. Adler did what he could to transform the pain that he felt in seeing this reality into lessons for life. He talked about looking at Buddha, because after all, Buddha looked at pain and suffering and used it as a way to grow as an individual. It nurtured his own enlightenment. It's an old and universal lesson to not turn away from the pain of other people, but to appreciate that and to understand how lucky we are. Our complaints fade in that context. Adler talks about life being, quote, a grand tragedy. I agree with that. But he also said that there are silver linings, which I think are important to hold on to. He said that there are, quote, islands of joy, havens of pure bliss. There is the laughter of children. It's right there. So confronting this bottomless pit doesn't mean you have to throw out joy. You have to hold on to them both. So as an adult, I permit myself to feel some joy, to have some comfort, to not feel the shame and guilt to such a degree that I just want to run away from the realities. I accept my own human limitations. What I don't accept, especially when confronted by such a moral imperative as trying to end hunger, is not trying to do better. Not trying to do better. Not trying to go from where I am now to where I could be tomorrow, to be more effective. So if you're like me, what do? How do you change that? Well, one of the things I do is I try to look inside for motivation. So I decided to fast for one day, to refrain from putting anything in my stomach other than water from about 11 o'clock on October 21st till breakfast on October 23rd. And I wondered whether it would help me fight hunger. I justified this experiment by noting that in many religions, fasting is fundamental to religious piety. Observing the Muslims fast during Ramadan from dawn to dusk for an entire month, or in the Jewish tradition, fasting on Yom Kippur is considered, which is considered the holiest of Jewish holidays, certainly improves the health of body and mind. That's promoted. And the discomfort of fasting serves a purpose. It reminds us of human frailty, of our own frailty. So I know that my little first world experiment, as I called it, was pretty lame. It was pretty lame. It was a weak attempt to generate empathy and sympathy. Will it help me confront the issue of world hunger? The most grave violation of our basic ethical ideals? Will it make me more efficient? Will it help this little flame of shame inside me do more efficiently, better? Can an empty stomach, even if it's just for a day, help me live closer to my ethical ideals? Well, when I thought about this about a month ago, I thought it was a good idea. I read about fasting, what to do and what not to do, like having carbohydrates, not proteins, the day before. What really scared me was not having any coffee. I'm serious. I walked by the Starbucks on the way to my train that Wednesday morning, and I almost broke my fast at 6:55 a.m. I'd had caffeine headaches before, and I didn't like it, but I had my water bottle. That was my trusty water bottle. I went to it whenever I had that pang for that day. I'd avoid heavy exercise. That's the other thing I did, but other than that, it was like any other day. I thought I might spend a lot of the day writing about hunger, that somehow it would stimulate me, and I didn't know whether that would make it harder to focus on food all day, or whether it would make it easier for me, because I was churning that into it. But I was comforted by the fact that my hunger would only last a day, and those suffering from chronic hunger don't have that comfort. Well, as it turned out, it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. The caffeine withdrawal eased over the day. Hunger pangs were mild at best. The headache I had the day after, the Thursday morning, was the worst. But I was able to make myself a cup of tea with some honey, and that soon faded, and I ate my breakfast with gratitude. Disappointingly, though, maybe predictably, it didn't give me any great insights. I thought it might. Or into hunger, or into our collective failure to end it, or why I didn't do more. And that didn't really surprise me too much in retrospect. I mean, it said inside this life of privilege and comfort, how could it possibly offer a key to this problem? But what was interesting was it did let me focus on what I thought about as this hunger of conscience. What was it that I wanted that I didn't have? This desire or this yearning for connection, or for what's doing what's right, or being with other people on this planet, even if it's just symbolically by feeling like I was connected with the millions and millions of people who are hungry every day. Now, this may not be pure altruism. In some sense, there is a self-interest involved in this, and I think that's important to admit and point out, because reaching out to others who are in dire need offers us a chance to have deeply meaningful relationships and ethical work in our lives. And I think that makes our lives more worth living. Without such connections and meaningful work, we get shut up in our small circle of friends, isolated from other people, denied the imagination and uplift of the spirit that doing good works for others can bring us. So there is self-interest involved. And one of my heroes pointed that out to me years ago, Jane Addams, one of the founders of the settlement house movement in Hull House. She looked into her life of privilege and she saw why helping others meant something to her. She said, how can I shut myself off to so much of the world and still reap the benefits of what the world has to offer? She considered her own conscience and awareness and decided that she didn't want to live a life of atrophied awareness and isolation. So in her biography, she said, quote, nothing so deadens the sympathies, so shrivels the power of enjoyment as the persistent keeping away of the great opportunities for helpfulness and a continued ignoring of the starvation struggle that makes up the life of at least half the race. So I could choose to ignore this starvation struggle. I could fill my mind with the distractions that we so often do of technology and media and schedules and drinking and drugs. Maybe the pain of others then would remain below the surface more, and I could drift through life sleepily unaware of the darker side of things. But I don't want to live a life of deadened sympathy and shriveled enjoyment, because I choose to shield myself from half of the world around me. I don't want to escape the pain and the price of losing connection to others. I want to feed what I think of as my hunger of conscience and my desire for connection. So maybe this one-day fast will be something that will improve my connection. I hope it will. I think only my deeds will tell. So I went to find out what are the most effective ways to handle hunger. I'll leave you with these, but you can look them up because I grabbed most of these off of a website with a message from Ruth Messenger, who's the president of the American Jewish World Service. This was advice I found very reasonable and pragmatic, and I think that's an important part of ethical humanism, looking for the best ways. Where's our leverage in all of this? So I'm going to use this as a guide for my actions. I've done some of it already, and I wonder whether any of this is something that you could take up. First, support grassroots projects that advance sustainable agriculture at community level. Community level. We do this a little bit at the Ethical Society through the Kiva program, the micro-lending, but it's going to the source, directly to people who are in need, empowering them. That's one. Two, write letters to the editors of your local paper demanding that governments cut or end food subsidies to large agribusinesses and corporations that overproduce food and then dump them on the developing world, driving local farmers out of business. So this old narrative of technology and American power and know-how is going to solve is not the answer. Three, not that it can't help, but currently it's not helping sustainable development in the third world. Third thing, ask your legislative representative to demand more foreign food aid, again, in the form of cash and training rather than food. We want to help local farmers be able to feed themselves and their families and their villages. The reality is also that rich countries give a paltry amount in development assistance. Right now, back in 2001, and I think we're giving less now as a percentage of our expenditures, the Congress allocated $10.7 billion to international development assistance, which is 1/6 of 1% of our gross domestic product. It's tiny. It's a tiny amount. Fourth, learn about the specifics of free trade. Find out what organizations practice that to help empower local people in third world countries. Find out what the definition of free trade is. There's a Green America's Guide to Fair Trade. You can download. I've ordered 10 copies. I'm going to bring some here when they come in. You can get them there. And then follow the recommendations. Buy from companies that get money back to the ground in other countries. Sixth, eat less meat. Every pound of meat requires about 16 pounds of grain, and that grain could easily feed the rest of the world. But again, it's more of a problem of distribution. Seventh, demand a worldwide reduction of the sale of pesticides and herbicides and genetically modified seeds, which are generally controlled by corporations, and they're not able to be given to the small farmers. So the small farmer has to rebuy the seed every year. It's a rigged game right now. And 8, advocate food security as a human right and shift food away from being treated as a commodity simply to be bought and sold by speculators. I'll send you those 8. You can go down and see Ruth Messenger on hunger. Let me know, I'll send this to you. To underline the point, though, I want to quote from the book that I was using, Ending Hunger in Our Lifetime, because it repeats some of this. It says, in a global society, increasingly interconnected communities can no longer conjure excuses for failing to banish chronic, recurring, and hunger-related crises affecting their neighbors. In fact, the global community stands indicted for knowing much about how to reduce hunger but not doing so. And in this context, business as usual takes on a distinctly unethical meaning, describing as it does the global effect falling far short of hunger anytime soon, even by 2050. To transform business as usual into a just, economically viable, and sustainable process, rich and poor countries alike will have to make a concerted effort to increase investments, produce technological innovations, create more effective and new institutions at local, national, and international levels to strengthen and establish viable social safety nets for the poor. Only then can we end hunger and thereby realize the most basic of human rights. I'd like to find out what you think is the best solution to world hunger. You can share that back at Talkback. I'd love to email it to me because I'm writing an article for the American Ethical Union Ethical Action Report. What do you think are the best solutions to hunger? Which of these work? Which have you done? Do you have a hunger for conscience that you want to feed by doing good? At our Humanist Thanksgiving in a couple of weeks, we'll pass the plate, and much of that money will go to Philabundance, which is one of the greatest local resources for feeding the hungry here. So I urge you to consider giving extra there. Maybe I'm going to continue this sort of symbolic fast now and then to see whether it helps me. Because I think that being a little hungry in my body did help feed the hunger of my conscience, which is what I hoped it would do. I want to have the connections. I want to do the good deeds, but I want to keep my eyes open. And that means seeing the suffering around us. So I just hope that the hunger of our conscience will help us feed the bodies of so many others. Thank you very much.